I never expected that summer to change everything. I thought I was going to Camp Riverside to be a counselor, to teach kids how to canoe and build campfires and maybe get a decent tan. What I didn't expect was Mason. What I didn't expect was how 3 simple words whispered in the dark could unravel everything I thought I knew about myself. It started the first night. We just met that afternoon during staff orientation, shaking hands in that awkward way guys do, trying to size each other up. Mason had this easy smile and dark hair that fell across his forehead, and when he laughed at something our supervisor said, I noticed. Not in any way that meant anything, I told myself. Just noticed. The counselor cabins were small, basically glorified sheds with 2 bunk beds crammed inside. Mason took the top bunk on the left, I took the bottom on the right. We spent that first evening unpacking our duffel bags, making small talk about where we went to school, what we were studying, the usual getting-to-know-you stuff. He was funny in this understated way, dropping little observations that caught me off guard and made me laugh. By the time we turned off the lights, I was thinking maybe this summer wouldn't be so bad after all. Then, in the darkness, I heard his voice, soft, almost tentative. "Good night, Adrian." I remember lying there for a second, surprised by how the sound of my name in his mouth made something flutter in my chest. "Good night," I said back, and tried to ignore the feeling. The next morning, we fell into the chaos of camp life. 100 kids between 8 and 14, all hopped up on sugar and freedom, and it was our job to keep them alive and entertained for 8 weeks. Mason and I were both assigned to the adventure activities, so we spent our days side by side at the climbing wall, the zip line, the high ropes course. I learned fast that he was good at this, patient with the scared kids, encouraging without being pushy. I watched him coax a terrified 10-year-old up the rock wall, his voice steady and calm, and something in my chest tightened. That night, after we'd collapsed into our bunks, exhausted and sunburned, it came again. "Good night, Adrian." Like it was the most natural thing in the world, like we'd been doing this for years instead of just one night. "Good night, Mason," I replied. And this time I noticed how I was smiling in the dark. It became our routine. Every single night, no matter how tired we were, no matter what had happened that day, Mason would whisper good night and I would whisper it back. Such a small thing. Such an ordinary thing. But lying there in the darkness, hearing his voice, I started to feel like it meant something more. Like those 2 words were a thread connecting us, pulling tighter with each repetition. The days blurred together in the way summer days do. We developed an easy rhythm, Mason and I. We could communicate with just a glance when a kid was about to do something stupid. We had inside jokes about the other counselors, about the camp director's terrible announcements, about the mystery meat they served in the dining hall. We started sitting together at meals, saving each other seats, gravitating toward each other during our breaks. I told myself it was just friendship, just 2 guys getting along well, making the best of a summer job. But I couldn't explain why my pulse quickened when Mason would clap me on the shoulder, his hand lingering just a second longer than necessary. I couldn't explain why I found myself watching him when he wasn't looking, noticing the way his shirt stretched across his shoulders, the way he bit his lower lip when he was concentrating, the exact shade of green in his eyes. About 3 weeks in, we had a night off and most of the counselors went into town to hit the one bar that didn't card too carefully. Mason and I stayed back. We told everyone we were too tired, but the truth was I didn't want to share him with anyone else. I wanted him to myself, and that realization terrified me. We ended up down at the lake, sitting on the dock with our feet dangling in the water, passing a bag of chips back and forth and watching the stars come out. The camp was quiet for once, just the sound of water lapping against the shore and the distant hum of crickets. Mason was telling me about his family, his 2 younger sisters, how his parents had divorced when he was in high school. There was something in his voice, something vulnerable, and I found myself telling him things I never talked about. How I'd always felt like I didn't quite fit anywhere. How I'd spent most of college feeling like I was playing a part, pretending to be someone I wasn't sure I actually was. He was quiet for a long moment after I finished. Then he said, "I know what you mean." His voice was soft, careful. I feel that way too sometimes. Like everyone else got some manual for how to be a person and I missed the distribution day. I laughed, but it came out shaky. We sat there in the dark, shoulders almost touching, and I was intensely aware of every inch of space between us. I wanted to close that gap. I wanted to know what it would feel like to lean into him, to rest my head on his shoulder, to have his arm around me. The wanting was so strong it made my hands shake. "We should head back," Mason said finally, and I couldn't tell if I heard regret in his voice or if I was just projecting my own feelings onto him. That night, when he whispered goodnight, I almost said something else. Almost said what I was really thinking, what I was really feeling, but I chickened out, whispered goodnight back like always, and lay awake for hours, listening to his breathing. The thing about realizing you have feelings for someone is that you can't unrealize it. Once I admitted to myself that what I felt for Mason was more than friendship, everything shifted. Suddenly, every interaction was charged with meaning. When we'd help each other with sunscreen, his hands on my shoulders would send electricity down my spine. When we'd joke around and he'd shove me playfully, I'd feel the ghost of his touch for hours afterward. When he'd smile at me across the campfire during evening activities, I'd lose track of whatever I was supposed to be doing. I started to notice things about him that I'd been deliberately not noticing. The way his eyes crinkled when he really laughed, the small scar on his left eyebrow, how he always smelled like cedar and sunscreen, the way he'd run his hand through his hair when he was nervous. I was cataloging him, memorizing him, and I didn't know what to do with all this information, all this wanting. Around week 5, we had a mandatory counselor meeting after the kids were asleep. We were all crammed into the main lodge, going over safety protocols for the millionth time, and I was barely paying attention. Mason was sitting next to me on one of the old couches, close enough that our thighs were pressed together, and I couldn't focus on anything else. At some point he shifted, and his hand ended up next to mine on the cushion between us. Our pinkies were touching. Just barely, just the smallest point of contact, but it felt monumental. I held perfectly still, terrified that if I moved, he'd move too, and this tiny connection would be broken. The meeting dragged on forever. The whole time I was hyper-aware of that single point of contact, that one pinky finger touching mine. Was he doing it on purpose? Did he notice? Was this nothing to him while it was everything to me? Finally, after what felt like hours, he moved his hand. But instead of pulling away, he hooked his pinky around mine. Deliberately. Intentionally. For just a second, he squeezed, then let go and stood up as the meeting ended. I sat there stunned while everyone filed out. Mason waited by the door, looking back at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "You coming?" he asked, and his voice was carefully casual. But his eyes weren't. His eyes were asking a different question entirely. I followed him back to our cabin in silence. The walk felt like it took forever and no time at all. We got ready for bed without speaking, the air thick with something unspoken. I climbed into my bunk, my heart hammering so hard I was sure he could hear it. The lights went out. "Good night, Adrian," Mason whispered, same as always. But this time his voice was different, rougher, uncertain. I took a breath, held it, let it out. "Mason," I said quietly, "can I ask you something?" "Yeah." He sounded as nervous as I felt. "Why do you do that? Every night, the goodnight thing." Silence. Long enough that I started to panic. Started to think I'd made a terrible mistake. Then I heard movement above me, the creak of the bunk bed frame. Mason's head appeared over the edge of his bunk, hanging upside down so he could look at me. In the dim light filtering through the window, I could just make out his features. "Because I like saying your name," he said simply. "Because I like knowing you're the last person I talk to before I fall asleep. Because it's the one part of the day that's just ours." My breath caught. "Mason," I started, but I didn't know how to finish. He swung down from his bunk with surprising grace, landing lightly on the floor next to my bed. He crouched down so we were eye level, his face close to mine. I could feel his breath on my face. "Tell me I'm not imagining this," he said quietly. "Tell me you feel it too." "I feel it too," I whispered. "God, I feel it too." He reached out slowly, giving me every chance to pull away, and cupped my face with his hand. His palm was warm against my cheek, his thumb brushing across my cheekbone. "Can I kiss you?" he asked, and the vulnerability in his voice made my heart ache. I nodded, not trusting my voice, and then his lips were on mine, and nothing had ever felt more right. It was gentle at first, tentative, both of us learning the shape of each other. Then I reached up and threaded my fingers through his hair and pulled him closer, and the kiss deepened into something hungry and desperate and real. He made this small sound in the back of his throat, and it sent fire through my veins. When we finally broke apart, both breathing hard, he pressed his forehead against mine. "I've wanted to do that since the second week," he admitted. "I've been losing my mind." I laughed shakily. "Try the first week. I've been going crazy." He kissed me again, softer this time, and then climbed into my bunk with me. It was a tight squeeze, definitely not designed for two full-grown men, but I didn't care. He wrapped his arms around me and I pressed my back against his chest, and for the first time in my life, I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. We talked for hours that night, whispering in the dark. He told me about his first crush on a boy in middle school, how he'd spent years trying to convince himself it didn't mean anything. I told him about my own denial, my own fear, how I'd never let myself really examine what I felt or who I was attracted to. We talked about being scared, about not knowing how to do this, about what would happen when summer ended, but mostly we just held each other, and that felt like enough. Every night after that, Mason climbed into my bunk. We'd whisper and kiss and explore this new thing between us with a mixture of excitement and terror and wonder. During the day, we had to be careful, had to maintain the facade of just being friends, but those stolen moments in the dark became everything to me. He'd trace patterns on my skin and tell me about his dreams for the future. I'd kiss his shoulder and admit fears I'd never said out loud. We learned each other in the darkness, building something fragile and precious between us. There was one night, maybe 2 weeks before camp ended, when we were lying tangled together and he went quiet for a long time. I could tell something was on his mind. "What are you thinking?" I asked, running my fingers through his hair. "I'm thinking about August," he said quietly. "About when this ends." My stomach dropped. "It doesn't have to end." He pulled back enough to look at me, and even in the dim light I could see the worry in his eyes. "We go to schools on opposite sides of the country. Adrian, I'm in California. You're in Massachusetts. That's not exactly a casual distance. So we figure it out," I said, hearing the desperation in my own voice. "We call, we video chat, we visit when we can. I'm not ready to lose this. I'm not ready to lose you." He kissed me then, deep and intense, like he was trying to memorize the taste of me. When we broke apart, his eyes were bright with unshed tears. "I'm not ready to lose you either," he whispered. "I think I'm falling in love with you." "I think I'm already there," I admitted, and saying it out loud felt like jumping off a cliff, terrifying and exhilarating all at once. The last week of camp was bittersweet. Every moment felt precious because we knew it was ending. We stole kisses behind the equipment shed, held hands under the table at meals when no one was looking, stayed up talking until dawn because we couldn't bear to waste a single minute sleeping. On the last night, after all the kids had been picked up and most of the counselors had left, we lay in my bunk one final time. "I'm going to miss this," Mason said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm going to miss you." "This isn't goodbye," I told him fiercely. "This is just the end of summer. We're going to make this work." He nodded against my chest. "Promise me something," he said. "Promise me we'll try. Really try, even when it's hard." "I promise," I said. "I've never been more sure of anything." We fell asleep like that, wrapped around each other, and when I woke up in the morning, he was still there, his face peaceful in sleep, and I thought about how much my life had changed in 8 weeks. I'd come to this camp thinking I knew who I was, and I was leaving as someone completely different. Someone braver, someone more honest, someone in love. That morning we packed up our stuff, exchanged numbers and social media and email addresses, made plans for me to visit him in California over fall break. We said goodbye in the parking lot, a quick hug that had to pass as platonic, but he whispered in my ear, "I love you, Adrian," and I whispered it back. I watched him drive away, his hand raised in farewell out the window. My chest ached with missing him even though he'd only been gone for 30 seconds. But underneath the ache was something else, something bright and hopeful. Because for the first time in my life, I knew who I was, I knew what I wanted, and I knew that what Mason and I had was worth fighting for. That was 3 years ago. We're still together. It hasn't been easy. Long distance is brutal, and there were times when we both wondered if we could do it. But we made it work. We visited each other whenever we could afford the plane ticket. We fell asleep on video calls. We sent each other care packages and stupid memes and long rambling emails about our days. We fought sometimes, about the distance and the frustration and the fear, but we always came back to each other. Last month, Mason graduated and moved across the country to be with me. We have a tiny apartment that's barely bigger than that counselor cabin we shared, and every night before we fall asleep, he still whispers it. "Good night, Adrian." And I whisper back, "Good night, Mason." Such a small thing, such an ordinary thing. But it still feels like everything. Sometimes I think about that first night, how I had no idea that those 2 words would change my life. How I couldn't have known that the guy in the bunk above me would become the person I can't imagine living without. How a summer job at a kids' camp would teach me more about myself than 4 years of college ever did. People talk about finding yourself like it's this grand journey, some epic quest. But for me, it happened in the quiet moments, in whispered good nights and stolen kisses and the courage to admit what I was feeling. It happened because Mason looked at me like I was worth taking a chance on, and I looked at him the same way, and we both decided to be brave. I never expected that summer to change everything, but I'm so grateful it did.